So Earl Bryan had founded all these like tech companies basically, and I think it had a lot of government contracts or whatever, and he had sold computers and technology to Iran, and to the point where he had learned Farsi. And that's sort of like what
that's how Michael ties him to
brings him to the table. You know, how he's said to have been involved in these negotiations to keep the U.S. hostages in Iran until after the election.
Oh, right.
Because he's homies with Ronald Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
Reagan. This is Michael's story. Just he's homies with Ronald. Earl Bryan is homies with Ronald Reagan. And he's going to deliver $40 million to the Ayatollah to keep the hostages in Iran, so that Reagan looks like
Jimmy Carter
looks weak. Reagan looks like a badass. And what ends up happening? I mean, this is why it ties so neatly to the history lesson. Is that, of course, Ronald Reagan wins the election, and within an hour, 30 minutes, whatever, of his inauguration speech, the hostages are on a plane going back to America. And it's like, wow, like Reagan won and he got the hostages back.
It definitely happened. And also his campaign manager is William Casey, who's this OSS super spy mastermind, wily motherfucker.
Wasn't he the head of the CIA
for Reagan?
For Reagan, after he does this secret squirrel mission in Iran to get the governor of California to become the president.
Wow.
He's then made the.
But this, just to be clear, this is we're kind of like. That's not necessarily even Michael's story.
It's not Michael's story.
This is Christian's.
I don't think Michael really went to Iran. He needs the onus is on Michael to come forward with some passport, photographs, some documentation that shows that he and Earl Bryan went to Iran and helped do this deal. Mm-hmm. But regardless of that, I think it definitely did happen. That the hostages were kept until after the election intentionally to benefit the Republicans.
Right.
If you look at what we ended up doing, I mean, we did a lot more research on the October surprise than ended up in the movie. And we talked to, several people who had some relationship to it or had investigated it. And then, of course, last year, the New York Times came out with this piece saying that, somebody, what's his name? Peter Baker, the New York Times came up with this piece saying somebody in Texas had admitted that he had been there for negotiations between that Texas congressman, what's his name? And that the October surprise really did happen that way, which is interesting because if you look at the people who really went into the October surprise, investigation on the journalistic side, guys like Robert Perry, they didn't have that story. They had other stories about William Casey's shenanigans. And what seems like to me might be the true picture of what happened is that William Casey, like any smart spy, had a bunch of things going on, many different sort of wheels within wheels and many different plans at foot. And one of them worked out, maybe one of them worked out. And if you have a lot of different things, it also creates an echo chamber where it's like, wait, how could that be happening at the same time this is happening? And it's like, well, maybe they're actually all happening. Just because multiple things seem like they are mutually exclusive doesn't mean that they are, I guess is my point.
Well, at the time, Iran was fighting a war with Iraq. And what Iran needed were parts for planes. They had a bunch of planes that didn't have tires.
American-made planes from after the revolution in 1979. America stopped giving them parts.
And they needed bombs and guns and, okay, so say the October surprise didn't happen, but right around the time that those meetings would have happened, the guns started flowing to Iran. And they didn't stop. I think that there's like the Iran-Contra, like I think is the limited hangout version of Iran-Contra is like they pick an arbitrary point in time for that scandal to start. But it really started especially if the October surprise happened, which I do believe it did. It started then. That's when those like
the relationship
and the arms traffic.
Which it's a perfect mirror, or not imperfect, but a pretty close mirror to what happened with Iran-Contra 6 years later, which is that there was another hostage crisis, and we were using weapons to negotiate for hostages. And it's like, well, how'd we get that idea? Like, maybe, the easy answer would be that we got that idea from ourselves when we did it, if you're the Reagan administration. Anyway, William Casey, just to put a little button on that, he becomes the CIA director. He, when called to testify in front of the Iran-Contra hearings, the day before he's supposed to testify, dies. Just so inconveniently for people who want to find out the truth, if he was going to tell the truth.
Bill Casey?
Yeah. And one other little octopus tentacle to throw in there is that he was outside counsel before all this to Wackenhut. He was a lawyer before that to Wackenhut. So it's like, when you think Wackenhut is like this boogeyman, right? But it's like has this funny name. But you really look into him, and they was up to some bad stuff. They also didn't they have the largest private repository of surveillance and other information on American citizens?
Yeah, they got that from the House Un-Americans Activities Committee.
Yeah, I think there's actually like 26 feet or something ridiculous of information on people.
Illegally surveillance.
Surveillance that's, I believe, sitting in the NYU library, because they got the Wackenhut files from they got those Wackenhut files from something. Anyway.
After they digitized them and put them on their promise.
Yeah.
And
if you really want to get conspiratorial.
And Danny somehow got access to copies.
Talking about yourself?
Yeah. Myself back in 1990 when I was 3 years old. He somehow got access to the checks that were written by the Kuwait royal family for like Adnan Khashoggi.
Yeah, I mean, those had been around.
We have like CBS nightly news reports that show those same checks and reports on them.
The Khashoggi stuff, a lot of the Iran-Contra stuff that Danny was looking into had happened in hearings a couple years earlier than that. What was interesting was
he got who was the guy from Oregon?
Brennicky?
Yeah, he got those checks from Brennicky.
Okay.
And so what Danny was doing, I think was like, well, what was Danny doing that's so special? It's like what he was doing was looking at Iran-Contra and then looking at the implosion of Bank of Credit and Commerce International, the bank we talked about,
that was connected to Iran-Contra.
Right, which was the implosion of that bank was happening in 1991, right when Danny's doing this. And he's looking at the savings and loan crisis. He's looking at all these things, and he's like, oh my gosh, all these people in Wackenhut, they're all actually literally connected. They all know each other or are part of the same things. And maybe the savings and loan scandal is really, part of an intelligence operation, or it's like popping up in that little place, and it's popping up here, and it's popping up here, and it's about essentially how money and power are moving around the world through intelligence networks of these like kind of dudes. And if you want to get deep into it, as like our editor Eric really got into, is like it's where their expulsion from the CIA after the various like church committee hearings and things like that in the 70s, Stansfield Turner comes into the CIA under Carter, and he's like, everybody's got to go. He like cleans house 30% or some huge amount of the CIA gets kicked out because it's like, you guys have been up to so much bad stuff, like so much illegal stuff. Like, we got to clean house here.
But now you have all these people.
You have these spies.
They've got a particular set of skills, in the
that don't adapt that well to civilian life.
And they got contacts all over the world.
Right.
And they've done things like Operation, and I'll try to get it right this time, Gladio, things like that, where you're, these guys, when you're working in the CIA, what is in your operations, what are you doing? You're generally going to other countries and committing crimes. Like, espionage in those countries is a crime. And the way you're doing it is often, sometimes, at least, working with criminals. And so Danny's idea, Casolaro, is that these guys are all the intersection between like a bunch of disaffected, pissed off spies who were kicked out of the administration under Carter. And it fits nicely because it's like, well, you do have William Casey, who's an ex-OSS officer, as Reagan's campaign manager, with George H.W. Bush as the vice presidential candidate who was the CIA director. It's like them coming in as under Reagan's cabinet, under Reagan's administration, and potentially engineering the return of, or the ascendancy of Reagan over Carter is basically, you could see it as the world's biggest fuck you to Stansfield Turner and Jimmy Carter, of being like, oh, you're kicking us out? Well, guess who's back, baby? And we're taking over. You know, like there's a way you can actually see that sort of thing where all these dudes, and Iran-Contra kind of becomes an exponent of that. I'm sorry if I'm just droning on here, but Iran-Contra becomes an exponent of that because it's former intelligence and military intelligence people who are working with the current administration, the Reagan administration.
They set up a private supply network.
To do a private supply network. It's if you want to see it in a related way, it's about the privatization of military intelligence, you know? Right. And whenever Reagan's like, you know, saying things like, you know, the worst sentence in the English language is "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." It's like, well, that's a really convenient viewpoint for somebody who's working with a lot of people who are about to make a shit ton of money off of like military intelligence under your administration.